If we're talking about my childhood, yes, very peaceful. Underdeveloped countries, not too many of the comforts that one would find other places, but a happy childhood, free from violence, free from lawlessness. The extended family system made everybody someone else's keeper. Of course, that all was changed when the trouble started in 1979, when we had the rice riots, and a year later, 1980, a coup d'etat. The whole environment then changed. So, but during my childhood and up until the time when when I was moving up professionally, the country was a great place to be. We had everybody knew everybody. It's a small country, small population, so it was easy. It was easy to move around, easy to pursue what one wanted. So the difficulty started after. There was, as we have now, commodity price increases and shortages of basic commodities, and rice was one of them. Rice is the staple of our country, and so the price of rice went up, and there was an attempt to try to stabilize the price by increasing it so as to provide an incentive for domestic production, and that led to riots. Now the riots are the riots said to be based on rice really was also a result of political turbulence, because there already was the movement to challenge the status quo. We had the monopolization of power and privilege in the country for a long time, and educated indigenous population was already emboldened, and so the shortage of rice provided an excuse for that. But that led to overreactive force by the government that left a lot of people dead. People were then imprisoned, and so the soldiers then a year later decided to stage a coup d'etat. These were non-commissioned officers, and as you know, there was a tremendous brutality associated with that, where 13 people were tied to stakes on a beach and shot. So many people were killed. When the coup d'etat came, I was the Minister of Finance, but he was shot. The previous, minister. There were 4 of us, of all the cabinet, that were spared, that were not killed or something. I was in a virtual house arrest for a while. The president was killed. There were 13 persons. Not all of them cabinet ministers. I think about 10 of them were cabinet ministers that were all shot. Samuel Doe was a sergeant, a very young sergeant, who led the rebellion and led all the action that took over. He pronounced himself the leader and proceeded to govern. Of course, he started off trying to, making sure that that the old order was totally challenged and uprooted. But it didn't take very long for him to adopt some of the same practices that he and his colleagues had criticized so much. As a matter of fact, even worse, because they introduced violence into the society, and they ruled by fiat, by decrees. The criticism of the settler population monopolizing power was simply replaced by his own ethnic group monopolizing power. And of course, there was not much done. A lot of corruption, not much development. So, and the brain drain. Most of the talented people left the country. Capital flight. Most of the businesses closed and sent their money out, and that started the economic free fall that we're only just recovering from. I was in a house the morning of the coup, and I was called for. To report, and I didn't. I waited until it was safe enough to go, and so I was escorted every day to a house to stay there and to come back every morning and report. When I left the country, the end of 1980, I actually went back to the World Bank. So I was on secondment from the World Bank when I came back in 1977. I went back to the World Bank for a year, but then I had a very good offer from Citicorp, and that's what took me to Nairobi as a vice president of Citibank regional office. Yeah, and I lived there for 5 years. General elections were called for 85, and I was persuaded to join others to form a political party. And I went back to help get the party organized and get it registered. And of course, that led to other things that led me in trouble. And that's when I, made a speech in the U.S. and said some things. The Independence Day celebration, 85, July 26. I spoke in Philadelphia on behalf of the Association of Liberian in the United States. Mm-hmm. And I spoke. I was a keynote speaker at that celebration, and I said a few things about the government. And I had been home trying to register the party, and I left and came to Philadelphia to make this statement, and then went back with the intent of just forgetting it since the party was not registered and going back to Nairobi. But then, of course, that's when I was put on a house arrest and subsequently was jailed. I went before a military tribunal, and they judged me guilty, sentenced me to 10 years, but I did not serve because there was a protest first by Liberian women, and then protest in the U.S. Congress also did a resolution threatening to cut off aid from the political prisoners, which I was one of, were not released. When you have colleagues who were shot on the beach, when you've gone back and you're working in the government and you form a political party and you've gone through a tribunal and all of that, you've already invested a lot in political life. So it's not something you walk away from, particularly if, as I feel, like you feel the country deserves more and you feel that with the right leadership that that country could be successful and its potential could be realized. So that was always part of the motivation. During the time when Mr. Taylor was, invading the country, and then you had a splinter group with his group, and you had the Prince Johnson faction, and they were all assaulting the capital, so to speak. Each one wanted to take power, and they were able to persuade Doe to leave his mansion where he had been holed up for quite some time, and to come out, and he was taken captive by Prince Johnson group, one of the warlords, and he was killed. Well, he was tortured. It was a terrible, terrible thing. I saw the video of it, and it's really dehumanized. The way he was killed was really, as bad as he was, nobody deserves that. Many of Liberians, we had been mounting a campaign against Doe for years without any success. And when Taylor started, his was supposed to be a movement, and all the right things about fighting against dictatorship and bringing back justice and equity into the society. So it wasn't until several months into his campaign into his movement, that we realized that his motives were selfish, and he was there to take power and to enrich himself. As a matter of fact, some of our colleagues from the 85 elections who went back into his area for safety and for protection ended up being killed. And that's when we started to distance from him. I had already invested a lot of my life in challenging. I had challenged the Dole regime. To a certain extent, I even challenged the Toba regime, which I was a part of. So taking on Taylor was like carrying on an unfinished business. And the unfinished business was really to be able to get the dictators out of the country, to get into a system where people had a choice, to start the process of reconstruction and renewal, a process that is just starting now, but with a legacy that's very, very difficult, with violence implanted into the value system and lawlessness being a part. It's difficult, but it's a process that we had to embark upon. And even though making that transition is difficult and going to be difficult, but it's the only way to move the country on to the right track, the track that we're beginning to move along. We organized, it was a party already there from 85. It was a part of what we call the Grand Coalition. At that time, I was a member of another party that we formed called the Liberian Action Party. It was part of that. So when I came back to run on the Unity Party ticket, this was in the 1997 elections, when Charles Taylor was making a bid following a small cessation of the war. We then built a party, around me and my candidacy, and had a very strong showing. We thought didn't have as much money as he, and didn't have access to the media or to the kinds of resources that enable us to travel around the country. So Mr. Taylor declared himself the winner. The official results gave him a large percentage, with me as a distant second. But then after that, we began to build a party. Of course, I had to leave again. I had to go into exile. I came back and was back and forth several times based upon when I thought it was safe to come and when I felt it was unsafe to be there and had to quickly run out. But this time I settled right in Abidjan, where I could keep my finger on the political pulse and use the proximity of being close to home to begin to do advocacy among the African leaders to point out that the situation in the country was not good, that we were headed for disaster. Mounted, along with others, an international effort to bring pressure on Taylor. And finally, of course, we all ended up in Accra for the peace talks. And I came back. Once I came back, then of course we mobilized the party to prepare ourselves for the 2005 elections. I was a candidate in 97. I didn't win. I felt, I'd earned the stripes and I could compete as effectively as anybody else had. Gone through all of the trials and tribulations of political life, and also had enough, I believe, international exposure, professionalism, and also I didn't think there was anybody who could be as competitive given my experience, background, and something. So I thought I was a formidable candidate, and I proved to be right. Mr. Weah was an icon in sports. He was a sports hero. He had won the Footballer of the Year for Europe, for Africa, several times. He was the idol of the young people, and our nation is very young. So he really was a very, very strong candidate. Nobody figured we could beat him because he was strong, and like I say, he's revered by the young people. Um, but we figured we're going to find where the weaknesses were, and the weaknesses were that he didn't have an education. He hadn't really done enough schooling, and we played on that on the basis that most of our market women sit in the sun and rain to send their children to school to get an education. Certainly, they wanted something better for people to aspire to. And people underestimated the power of women. Grassroots women who mobilized because they felt for the first time a woman was competitive enough with the courage and the competence and the background to do so, and they mobilized. Now, Mr. Weah was a very strong candidate, no doubt. In the first round, he came over ahead of everybody, but clearly he didn't have a clean win. But he would have had to have 51. I mean, 50 plus 1. That's what our Constitution requires, 50% plus 1. So he didn't, and the Constitution says that if you don't get 50% plus 1, then the two persons with the highest number of votes go into a runoff. And I was second under him, and so we both went into a runoff. But in a runoff, we had great strategy in our runoff. I mean, we ran a door-to-door campaign, and the women rose to the challenge, that one. Yeah. And some of the young people, too, even though, like I said, he was the idol of the young, but that was mainly the young street kids, the uneducated, because the university students felt differently. And many of them rallied to us, the young university student who felt that an education did matter, and to be able to run a country, you had to have a certain level of knowledge. So we were able to get them, to be a part of our campaign, yeah. Simply because I do believe in the potential of our country. And I felt if anyone else had the fortitude and the capability and the international contact to be able to make it work, that I could, yeah. And I still believe in that, and I think the progress we've made in these 2 years does support that view. I could have taken the winner-take-all position, and I'm still criticized by my own party today because of that. But if you look into my cabinet, you'll see people who were presidential candidates, vice presidential candidates, leading people in the other opposition parties and whatnot. And I was the first one to send a signal that no matter who won, the country needed the participation and the support of everybody. Some of the other things that will, enable us to achieve our objective we're still making small progress, not enough, like jobs for the young people, education for the young people, the war-affected youth, thousands and thousands of them. We did complete what is called the DDRR, or Demobilization, Disarmament, Reintegration Program for over 100,000 of them. But still getting them into school, getting them skills, getting them jobs is still an ongoing process and still a challenge. That's just ensuring that the resources that come, from our mines are properly accounted for, properly used, with the public being fully informed on what those resources are and where those resources are applied through the proper budgetary process and whatnot. So, and the process is monitored by a civil society group to make sure that there are checks and balances. The information comes from the government institutions concerned, but that information has to flow to this group that comprised civil society people. We also asked the companies involved to participate so that they can give the information directly, to the watchdog group. And we willingly joined it because it helps us to make our commitment to accountability and transparency. So we also, even though they say extractive industries, which are mainly the mines, we have iron ore and gold and diamond, but we also added forestry, by our own voluntary action, because forestry had been a source of the misuse of resources in the past, and became part of what fueled the regional war through using those resources for arms. So I think it's a combination of many things. For one thing, we have to give these kids some skills. We have to, give them back their dignity. And a dignity means they should be able to earn a livelihood without having to resort to stealing or begging or extortion. I grant you that for many of them who are hardcore, very difficult to even get them to be willing, to go to school and to obtain the skills, because the only way they're used to. But if we can get the critical mass of them to begin to get a job, and it's starting to happen, and to begin to go to school and to appreciate the fact that you can't go very far. Right now, you're in a change environment where knowledge and skills is what gets you what you want. There's not going to be many opportunities. On the other hand, we also have to have penalties, so that if you commit criminal acts, rather than using the opportunity to earn, that there's a penalty to be had. And so we also use that. Counseling is necessary. We still have a challenge there, to change the mindset of those who know no other way. And like I said, that's still a challenge for us. We're still trying to work on that. Even before my administration started, the Association of Female Lawyers, given that the incidences of rape are so high in our country, had already, got a legislation passed that made rape, well, it is a criminal offense. It's a crime against humanity today, as also recognized by the United Nations. But also, they made the penalty life imprisonment by this new law, so what I did was to ensure that we tried to enforce the law, and also start a program of education with the families. We still have problems with that. Enforcing the law in a judicial system that is weak and that is still very male dominated is difficult. They don't think the penalty equals the crime, unfortunately. So, and also it's a bailable offense, and because our correctional system still, again, has a lot of weaknesses, human rights group are able to apply for habeas corpus every time, and they get out. So one of the things I'm committed to do is to also amend that law to make it a non-bailable offense, so that would keep them in prison until such time that they've gone to trial. But more importantly, we have to work with the families, for disclosure, for preventing poor families from keeping silent, because small amounts of money are offered to them to buy their silence, and they're, young kids, and the kids are young. That's very disturbing, talking about 3-year-olds up to 10-year-olds, very, very sad. For example, if a thief is caught and they feel that thief, as the experience shows, may get away or may bribe his way or pay his way. So mob action sometimes, they're very violent, have even killed, or if they feel that their rights have been infringed upon by policemen or security people. Mob action, they sometimes go and challenge. They've also destroyed police stations and all of that where they felt justice was not done. And again, we have to also instill in them that, one crime does not deserve another, that there's the rule of law that they all have to subscribe to. And so that's but that, again, it comes from the violence that has been, put into the value system, that you solve every problem through violence and may the stronger one prevail. It's been on an increase recently. The incidence is far lower than, other places. We're just completing a census, so I can't tell the numbers I've heard is somewhere like 5%, 6%. I'm not sure whether that's the right number because they have varied. But we know that there's been increasing cases of that, and particularly among the young women, the young population, and young girls. So, and we're trying to combat that with the support of the Global Fund. There's an HIV/AIDS program that gave the retroviral treatment to people. And then, of course, there are lots of sensitization program to encourage prevention. But it is a problem, and it's something that we have to continue to monitor. We've established an AIDS commission. I chair that commission to bring the full attention, to that. They're still at work. It has, I think they've done a lot through testimony to gather a lot of information. It's also opened up old wounds because in those testimonies, lots of people have been accused, and but it's still part of the cleansing process. So it's ongoing. They're trying to complete their testimonies, and their report is due in by the end of the year. Their mandate enables them to make recommendation that would lead to justice in those cases where, where wide-scale amnesty is not determined the best course of action. Their mandate also could call for some form of reparations, for communities that have been affected. So we wait for them. I think it was a necessary process. It has caused some problems in the society, like I said, through testimonies that accuse some people holding high elective offices and all of that. But it's a process that needed to be done, and we'll see where it comes when the report is made. Some of the people we're talking about have elective positions, and there's nothing we can do about that. They were allowed to run. Our election laws did not prohibit them from running. They ran, whether they ran on a platform of fear or whether they ran on a platform of promise. It's probably both, but they won. And many of them are sitting in the legislature where they're there. We have to deal with them. We have to work with them. You make an assessment of where we are. That's what we've done, and you set your infrastructure targets, and we've put that. We started out with what we call our 150-day action plan that brought back lights into the capital city for the first time in 14 years and brought some water into the homes for the first time. And now we've laid out a full action plan under our poverty reduction strategy, where we've identified how many roads we will build and how many schools we're going to build or renovate, and how many clinics, and we've got them time bound. that's what we work with. Also, our partners on this, and we've been getting good support from the United States, from the European Commission, from many of the bilaterals, the Scandinavian countries that have. So we're if there's any constraint, it's sometimes implementation is slower than we would want it, because we've got to follow all the process and procedures of all the many donors that support us, and sometimes I always call it the long road between commitment and cash. But we're traveling that road, and we're beginning to see the roads are being repaired right now. So many schools are being reopened, and clinics, and we hope to expand electricity some more within the next few months, and more water. We're talking about rural electricity. So another couple of years, I think we will have restored many of the facilities that were destroyed during the war. Example. First of all, you have to set the example. And that example has to show in integrity, courage, ability to make decision, competent. And then inspiration and motivation. I mean, you've got to be able to carry people with you, and to set your goals very clearly, and to have them agree with those, and to motivate them to achieve the goals that have been set. So, listening, being able to respect others' views and take those into account, and sometimes we're, as leaders, we're also guilty with not giving due recognition. That motivates people by telling them when they've done a good job. Sometimes and I'm guilty of that too, sometimes we see the faults so often and not see the contribution. I've never reached the point of hopelessness where I felt I wouldn't survive. I've reached many points of disappointments. After the 1997 elections, for example, after all the effort we made and the results that were announced said, it's an impossible task. We're dealing with a warlord who has immense power, who has to support, The first thing I suggest, forget it, give it up, go back into international professional life and something. So it took a little bit of a resolve and reflection to say, can't give up, you gotta stay the course and suffer the consequences, the indignities and the difficulties. But I think that was a low point, right after those elections, when everything just seemed like an exercise in futility. I think it comes from childhood. It comes from parents, from the experiences that they had. My father, in a way, was a leader, since he was one of the first sort of native persons in our legislature. He was a lawyer, but he was also, like I said, the first one to represent the indigenous population in our legislature. That set him up as a leader, and so he moved around in that circle. My mother was a teacher, but that also enabled her to exhibit some leadership by bringing so many of the children in the neighborhood remember her and the role she played. She subsequently became a pastor, and that put her in a leadership position in the church. So I suppose it's that upbringing that maybe set me on that path. As I said, they came from essentially indigenous families, but were brought up by settler families. And the main reason for their own parents giving them up to other families was to ensure that they had an education, recognizing that in our environment in those days, without an education, since you did not come from an elitist background, you wouldn't go very far. So in our family, hard work and education were the two things that were stressed. My maternal grandfather came from Germany, and he was one of the many German traders that penetrated the West African coast and did business in one of our rural areas. But during World War II, when the Allies were fighting Germany, Liberia having, being so close to the United States, with the emancipated slaves having founded the country, we identified with the Allies forces and also declared war on Germany and expelled all of the Germans who were in the country. And so my grandfather left the country when my mother was at a very, very early age. Not his wife, just him. Because his wife was my grandmother, my mother's mother. And he left the country and left her with my grandmother, who was, was an illiterate, sort of a market woman, a native woman. And they never heard from him again, and we never pursued that, that heritage. The rest of my parents, my mother's mother, as I said, was a native marketeer, and both of my father's parents were indigenous. I wasn't a valedictorian or anything like that, but serious enough to have made every class and to have been one of the outspoken ones in our graduation, our high school graduation. It didn't work out that way, but one recognized as one of those that would go far in terms of a profession. It ended up that way, but it didn't start that way, since I got married right after high school and had four children before going back to college. I quickly settled into marriage life, and with just a high school education, that didn't mean very much in terms of a profession. And with 4 children born successfully almost every year, I became a housewife very fast, and it took a while, and perhaps driven by seeing some of my high school classmates, leave the country and go and pursue a college education, and all becoming professionals. It drove me to go back to college at some point, and that started a whole new career. He was an agriculturalist. He had to, as a matter of fact, he had come back from the University of Wisconsin, where he's done work in agriculture, and that's how we got married. And then after our 4th son was born, we both went back, and that's when I went back to college, and he went back to do graduate work again at the University of Wisconsin. Fortunately, we have in Africa the extended family system. It's no way we both could have gone to school in the U.S. with four young children. So 2 got left with my mother and 2 with his mother. And that's how we were able to go back to school. It is quite a sacrifice, because you leave your children at an early age, and you miss the time those days of their early childhood. It's a sacrifice that so many of us in the underdeveloped countries have to make if you want to pursue a profession. And if you in our case, you can always come back and try to make up. And I'm glad that our family was able to make up, and to see them all go through, finish college, and now married and in professional life. I remember, some of the teachers that taught us in high school were really missionaries, Methodists from the Methodist Church Many of them had left the United States and were serving in this school. One or two of them are still alive today. And there's been some contact recently. Tried to reestablish contact with them, but I do remember Robert Griffin is the name, so many others. The one I mentioned that has reestablished contact, as a matter of fact, did write a note to congratulate and to say, how pleased I am that we didn't know those years when we were, helping you to get an education that you would reach where you are today. So, and I guess some credit must go to them too, that they must have moved us in the right direction. In school, I had thought I'd be an English teacher like my mother. But then after I got married, I had to work. We had to support 4 children. And so I got a job in a small garage, an automobile outfit, automobile spare parts and repair shop. And I happened to have been assigned to someone who was an accountant, as his helper. So I picked up a little bit of bookkeeping there, and I suppose that's what set me on that track. It's the one sort of after-school profession that I knew, occupation that I had, and I was able to pick it up quite readily. And so when I went to college, I just pursued it. I already have some rudimentary knowledge about it, having been exposed to it through work. So it was easy to just continue on that path. And since then, I just remain in the financial and the economic field. It's a stretch, but in between, I picked up a lot of things because I to get to the World Bank, I had to, I'd already left the shop. That was a long time ago. I'd gone and finished college. I'd come back from college. I was then working in the then Treasury Department, now what we call Ministry of Finance, and had actually worked with people who exposed me to things other than, say, accounting, but started things that had to do with economics and management and all of that. So that really prepared me to go back to graduate school. And in graduate school, I did economics. That's how come I did my graduate work at Harvard. I was a special assistant to the Minister of Finance, what was then, in 1969. And then went off to graduate work at the Economics Institute, University of Colorado at Boulder, and then to Harvard, where I completed my master's, then came back. By this time, I was divorced because, trying to get back to school and trying to work after coming back from undergraduate school, having to work, put a great strain on the family. And ultimately, there was domestic problems, domestic violence. And by the time I went to do graduate work, I had already had a divorce before I went to do graduate work. By the time I got there, I had already, come back and started work after undergraduate, had, in a way, established my leadership in the ministry where I worked. The opportunity to get a scholarship to go and do graduate work was on the basis of having already established myself as, through performance, that I was on the way up and that the potential there was good. So, yeah, I'd already earned that. I think in our environment, you have to be both. On the one hand, you have to be strong enough to take the hard decisions that classify you, characterize you as an Iron Lady, meaning, in the midst of what may be formidable forces, you have to make the right decision and stand by it with the courage it takes. But then we're also in a society of many young people, children who had lost all hope, and just a few years ago, you saw nothing but despair in their eyes. and you want to be able to reach out to them with the sensitivity of a mother and grandmother, and so so in that environment you have, and I'm so glad that one of the things I always said is to make the children smile again. And whereas before, if they saw a presidential convoy approaching, they would all run helter skelter because they didn't know what would happen to their parents, security agents coming to look for. But today, if the siren sounds, they all gather on the streets. And most times I get down off the. So that's Ma Ellen comes from that. It's it's a nice name for a grandmother. The progress we've made at home. For example, our debt issue. We inherited a 3.7 billion debt for our population and our export earnings, and today, majority of that debt has been canceled, and we've completed our first program with the IMF, and also the restoration of hope. Today, our image of being a pariah state, a failed state, has turned around completely, whereas Liberians were afraid to carry a Liberian passport because you'd be seen as this nation, death and destruction. Today, Liberians are very proud to carry their passports because everybody sees Liberia as, beginning to be uplifted and beginning to become a possible model of success, post-conflict success story. So I'm very proud of that turnaround in our image.